Is it possible to build a responsive website for Internet Explorer 6? It's 2022 and I'm taking you back in time to somewhere between 1996 to 1999. I think it's an interesting topic. Developers and designers are using modern frameworks that use CSS3, like Bootstrap or many others, but can't actually build a website that will support Internet Explorer 6. If you think it's interesting, stick around, I'll show you how. You're probably asking how can we work today with Internet Explorer 6? If you search online, you probably wouldn't find it, or it probably wouldn't work on your current Windows. The way that I'll be using it is to run a virtual machine with Windows XP. Windows XP back then came with IE6, so that's a good way to run it and test things. Before I start with the code, I had some rules to follow based on my experience. Rule number 1. No CSS3. That's an obvious one. CSS3 properties are not going to work because it came out only after the time of Internet Explorer 6. Rule number 2. Use width only with percentage. A good example for this one can be something like that. Let's say you want to have a container of 900 pixels width. The container will remain 900 pixels all the time and you'll end up having a horizontal scroll bar at the bottom, which means it's not going to be responsive. Rule number 3. No media queries. With media queries, we can change the layout of the page depending on the screen size. And this is how today we can easily decide what the page will look like if it's, for example, lower than 900 pixels. So it's not going to work. I also wanted to mention that it's 1996 and we don't have smartphones and mobile websites are not a thing yet. And the last one that I could think of, rule number 4, no PNG. If you'll try to add a PNG image to a website on IE6, it wouldn't work as expected. The transparency will show up as a color. So these are the rules that I followed. Let's move on to the code. I'll be using Dreamweaver 8 from Macromedia. That will be the code editor on the left side and Internet Explorer 6 on the right side. I have a folder with HTML and CSS files. There is also a folder for images. For this example, I'll be working with a header image and a few icons. Okay, let's start coding. Let's add basic H1 and P tags, and let's set the Georgia font only for titles, and the rest will be Arial font. Let's organize it and wrap it with a header class with a dark background and some padding, and the text color should be white. And as we go, I'll reset the default spacing of the body tag. You're probably asking why I'm not using a library like normalize.css. That's not going to work. I believe developers started to use it when version 8 came out. Let's add a container to the page and see how this one goes. If you remember rule number 2, to use width only with percentage, when you set a container with pixels, that is a static value. If we set width of 900 pixels to the container, it will be all the time the same value. But if I'll set this container to 80%, for example, it becomes dynamic. It means that this container will be 80% and we have 20% remaining for space. Okay, great, so everything is responsive so far. Let's continue. Okay, so now we can add the background image that I have for the header. I'm going to style the content inside of that. Nothing special, just basic CSS. Now let's say I want to add a button. I'm curious if the button tag will work, because I used this tag maybe only after around 2015, but I believe it was exist. I just use A tags instead. So it's pretty cool to see that it's working. Okay, so I'm going to switch to A tag and continue from there. Okay, so let's style the button. I'm going to set the background to white and text color to black. Let's say padding 20 pixels, margin from top and bottom 40 pixels, and let's try the display none block. Let's save it, refresh the page, and it's working. And I believe it's working only for elements that have display inline as a default. Let's add some over effects for the button. We can also remove the underline, and the button is working perfectly. Let's see if we can use the shorthand declaration of the font property. Let me set the font weight, font size, font family in the same line, and it's working. Okay, let's add navigation at the top. I would like to put it inside of the header. Let's add a few buttons and continue with the styling. Moving on to styling, this is going to be a simple navigation style. Let's reset the spacing and let's try to put all the buttons in one row with display inline block. Inline block is not really changing anything when I refresh the page, but actually if I'll use the display inline, it's working. And this is fine, we can use that. It's such a clean syntax for this whole browser, but there is another way that may support even more browsers, and I'll show you that too. But before that, let me just set some hover styling to the navigation. Great, the navigation is ready. The other way that I was talking about, instead of display inline, I'll set it to float left, but we'll have to add another element with clear both below that. Let's save it, refresh the page, and it's working. Now I want to make sure that what we did so far is working, so I'm going to test it just like that, and everything seems to be fine. We have a responsive header. Now that we have the basic idea of how to create responsive sections and containers, let's say we want to add a content section just below the header. Let me create a generic section so we could use many times. I'll set another one with gray background. With that, we can go to the HTML and add this section class to each one that we want. And we can obviously switch between the two easily. But this is pretty basic. I want to continue to something more interesting. Let's continue with creating another section below that. In this section, I want to have two columns side by side. And for each one, I'll put some elements inside. Let's say with an icon, a title, and a short description. Let me set the size for the icon. And that brings me to the no-PNG rule that I mentioned. Do you see that square behind the icon? That should be transparent. Internet Explorer 6 doesn't support it, so this is how it would look on a page. If you really want to put that icon on the gray background, you can edit the PNG file with Photoshop or similar software and give it the same background color that you have on the website and save it as JPG. So it's not going to be transparent, but this is just a trick or an idea of making it work on a specific background. Let me switch back to JPG and I'll switch the background color between the containers so the icons will look better. Let's continue with the columns. Width 50%, float left should do the trick here. This is how we can put the columns side by side. Now when I check that, it doesn't seem to be responsive. It's doing this weird thing that it's jumping in specific sizes. And it's probably because this column that we set is not really 50%. There must be something here by default that adding more space. And today we can fix it easily if you use the box sizing border box to reset all the elements. But this is a CSS3 property and it's not going to work here. Instead, I'll just reduce the width just a bit and that will do it. So that should work. It should be responsive now. I can also add another row and it will look perfect below it. Great, we have this section ready and responsive and we can go on to the next one. Let's continue with just another simple section, maybe something like testimonial or review section. I want to test the position relative and position absolute, and I want to add this quote sign just to play with the position property. I'll create a review class and inside of it I'll put icon and message. Let's set the parent to be position relative and the icon that inside of the parent will be absolute. Let's set the position absolute with the top and left properties. I'll set a color, a font family, and a font style. Okay, so let's check it out. It's pretty basic. We can probably add a slideshow for that with JavaScript, but that's another topic. Moving on to another section below, let's create a contact form. I feel like this one is going to give me a hard time. I'll give it a title of contact. I'll use the from tag to make sure it's more accessible. Let's add inputs. The placeholder is not going to work here. Let's say I want to have name, email, and phone. And by the way, this is not HTML5, so input type email is not something that you can use here. So before that HTML5 placeholder feature, we used to write JavaScript validation. Let's continue with styling the form. I'll set all the inputs to full size and you'll see that it's fully responsive here. We can style it like how we're styling forms today if you want. One thing I noticed, we can't use this attribute selection with CSS, but we can use the class instead. Okay, we're almost done with the form. Let's style the button and add some colors and spacing. So the form looks nice and it's responsive, but the form is full width all the time. What if you wanted to use something like max width of CSS3, like how we're using today? I can try something like that. Maybe I'll change the width of the container, only the container of the contact section, let's say for example 50%. Let me have a look. Now it's smaller, but it's 50% all the time. I want it to be smaller, but for mobile I want it to be 100%. I want the same behavior like the way we're using max width today. How can we do that? There is actually a trick for that if we use a table. Let me show you how. I'll create a table with only one column for this case, and I'll put the form inside of it. The trick will be to set a width for the table cell. So for example, if you wanted something like max width 600 pixels, we will put here width equals 600. And look at that, it's 600, and for devices that are smaller than 600, it will be 100%, which is really cool. It's like using the media queries before it was introduced. And look at that, we have a nice looking page for Internet Explorer 6. I actually enjoy doing that, even though we didn't have the DevTools for inspecting the HTML and CSS. I liked it, it's classic. The page is responsive and working well on Internet Explorer 6 and should be also accessible. We can also navigate with the tab key on the keyboard. Alright, that was awesome. Too bad we gotta go back to the future. Whichever year you're watching it. Okay, I got it. You want me to go?